Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Dr. Douglas Boin. He is a professor at St. Louis University, where he teaches in all areas of the ancient Mediterranean world, the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, as well as the history of cities in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. He is keenly intent on exploring broader issues related to the transformation of Roman society, which is another way of saying he works at the intersection of politics and religion in ancient history. Dr. Boin has written several books and numerous articles, including Coming Out Christian in the Roman World, which was published in 2015, and his most recent work, Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's History of the Fall of Rome, which was published earlier this year, and that will be our topic of discussion today. Of Alaric the Goth, the Boston Globe writes, a cogent, readable text that vividly conveys the fears and confusion that surrounded the issue of immigrants' rights in a period of the declining Roman Empire. But from my point of view, his is an interesting take that attempts to present the history of a declining empire that we all know, not from the perspective of the Romans, but from the Gothic king Alaric. Welcome, Professor Boin.
Rob, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
So would this classify as Alaric's first Christmas special then?
I think the red cover of the book is certainly, an alluring book cover for the holidays. It's really kind of remarkable to be here to be able to talk about his story. I just have to say thank you for this opportunity again.
You're very welcome. Well, Dr. Boin, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Southern Gothic Unfiltered Pilsner from the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company of California. Just like the Barbarians, this Pilsner is steeped in tradition, but ready for anything. It is hop-forward, but light-bodied, crisp, and very drinkable. It is perfect for an afternoon relaxing on the porch, or after a hard day pillaging a Roman settlement on the Danube. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. Also, it is important to subscribe to the podcast itself. Subscribing is the only way to get new episodes right away, and there are new shows every single week. To the growing list of listeners and supporters from across the globe and around the country, thank you. And I would like for you to check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel as well. And now I raise my Southern Gothic Unfiltered Pills, and to barbarian and Roman alike, I say cheers. Now, the Goths have an interesting place in history, but they are very misunderstood. So who were the Goths really, and where was ancient Gothia?
Like most of the kind of lower class or non-elite people of any type of history, really, in ancient Rome, it's very hard to kind of tell their stories. We just don't have the mainstream literature or the really popular epics about anyone else other than, the Romans themselves and who they found important. So the Goths who lived and dwelled on the border of the Roman Empire in a land that they called Gothia, lived in the northeast of this very large, very empire that crossed continents, really. The Roman Empire of the late 4th century was a place of almost 60 million people. We have to kind of take account that some of them were citizens, not all of them were. There was rampant slavery that made the economy run. But all around it, from the Sahara deserts to the Arabian deserts to the lands north of the Danube River, were outsiders. And the Goths were one of those groups of outsiders who called the northern Danube regions their home. So geographically, we're really thinking of a mountainous landscape near what we would consider Transylvania, and then rolling into hills and marshes and meadows that extend to the Danube's mouth at the Black Sea. That's really where we're looking at. And they were simple people. So we don't really expect, and we don't have a lot of writing from them. And that made this a very challenging story to tell.
Were the different groups of Goths similar to Native Americans in the sense of different languages or even customs, or were they a more homogeneous group than that?
I think that's a great question. One of the tasks that I kind of had for myself was how to describe them, especially with not much literature remaining. So my interest and my expertise are really a lot archaeological. So I did a lot of actually reading around in American history in particular, indigenous studies in particular, to try to get a sense of how other historians tackled this prospect of describing a group and describing group identity from the outside when the sources tend to be very thin. And the best that I was able to kind of come up with, piecing together what the Romans said about the Goths, and then recognizing what evidence they left for us on the ground, is that I really think they do demand a much more complicated impression. They call for a much more complicated impression than just a homogenous group. We know that there were two tribes, at least, who show up as, in unflattering terms in the Roman sources, the Tervingi and the Grutungi. And we can sketch where they lived geographically, approximately. But for the most part, I think the exciting challenge for me as a historian was to figure out how to keep them as colorful as they were. These were people who had an incredible outdoor communal life. They may not have had schools that they went to, but we know that they had a robust sense of exploring nature and being interested in the natural properties of the helpful properties of plants and trees. So I really tried to just, like you said, I think capture a sense of them as a pastiche, as a mosaic. I hope does them justice.
So how do we really know about Alaric and the Goths then? Because you bring up an interesting challenge. It seems like it would be very difficult to do that research with all of the interpretations and primary sources coming exclusively or almost exclusively from the Romans. And of course, that would come with Roman stereotypes and prejudices, which of course they had toward the Goths. I mean, they didn't even have a written language until, unless I'm mistaken, their contact with Roman Christian missionaries. So was it difficult, or how do you go about the research when there are such few Gothic primary source material available?
That's really just an outstanding question, and I'm glad that you asked it, because I think the further back in time we go in history, today we can sometimes expect, or we can kind of train ourselves to be comfortable with that kind of historical take that just gives us the narrative, and we digest it and we learn it and we move on. And for me, as a professional in this field who happens to kind of be speaking outside of it, it's very important, like you said, to get at the root of where the sources are coming from, what the biases are, where the absences, the gaps are, and how we might fill them. Because I think that's the fun part of what a historian does, is knowing where to look and where not to look. So I have to say, when I first started the project, this was maybe 2015 or so. I had just completed a major textbook on the end of the Roman Empire, and we were talking about what to do next, some folks and I knew that I wanted to write about the end of the Roman Empire, but I wanted to do it from an original perspective, something that just wasn't expected. So I remember picking up a book, and picking up an ancient source book that was written in the 6th century, and it happens to be the only Latin source to describe the history of the Gothic people because it was written by a person who had Gothic heritage. His name was Jordan, and he wrote this book called The History of the Goths. And you can get it today as a cheap paperback, and it's been read for hundreds of years, mostly because the stories that Jordan tells about where his people came from and where their land was based and the history of his famous political leaders. It reads like an absolutely wondrous, marvelous fairy tale. And of course, with the intervening 2,000 years that we've had to kind of analyze what it is that he's saying, the consensus is that pretty much everything that Jordan has told us is absolutely wrong. This was actually one of the reasons why I went and picked it up first, because I just wanted to absorb myself into what he was saying. And he tells these amazing stories of, the Goths fought with Alexander the Great, or they were at the back of Troy. They're related to witches. So much of it, I'm reading it with my pencil, and I'm literally line iteming, vetoing all of, every other paragraph is just filled with things that are not useful to a historian because they can't be substantiated. And I remember looking up at that point, wondering if I'd gotten myself into a lot of trouble, thinking like, how was I going to go about telling the story? And I looked at what was left on the page, and what was left on the page was all of the details of nature, of the rivers of Gothia, the trees of Gothia, the outdoor life, the animals, the hunting stories, the birds of prey, everything that would make for a tribesman and his family's everyday life. And at that point, my historical instinct, which is always to find a way to verify a fact, my historical instinct led me to say, you know what, we might be able to find archaeological confirmation of these animal bones buried somewhere, for example. We might be able to still have paleobotanical clues about the trees and the foliage that were in the area. And as soon as I started kind of pivot away from the overly dramatic telling that Jordan had put into his book, I found that I had my way into the story of who the Goths were, and it was going to come through something simple, and it was going to come through something natural, literally. And I think that's how I started to fill in the decades of Alaric's life that we just don't have. And it was just to be a little creative with how we think about the evidence.
I'm interested in the relationship between the Goths and the Romans. It seems troubled from the very beginning. It's based on the way I remember it, subjugation and exploitation and degradation of the Goths. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it sadly is. And I think it's not actually unique to the Goths either. The Goths, wherever they came from, we're not quite sure how their people landed or wound up in this part of Northern Europe. We're not the first tribes to call that area their home. And the Romans had long fought, going back 200 years prior to Alaric's story, had fought wars in this area to conquer it, take over the land. This was, at one point in the story of Rome, the most exciting frontier that you could look at and hope for as a kind of merchant or trader or kind of pioneer in Rome. You wanted to go to the northeast. There was gold in the Transylvanian mines. There was wealth to be made in the cities there, and the Romans were ruthless about colonizing the area and then eventually settling it and stealing local indigenous folks to become slaves. So the Goths, by the time of the 4th century, are living in a landscape that has been entirely kind of gutted by Roman power and by the whim of Roman power to just decide at one point that they would leave. And so I think that's a really important part of the story to hit at the beginning, is this sense of powered relationships that just looms over everything.
I know that one of your areas of expertise is religion. The conversion to Christianity by many Goths was led by a Roman missionary named Little Wolf. I'm sure there were others. Were these efforts initially rejected? Did they maintain any of their pagan traditions even after conversion? And I know most practice a form of Christianity based on the teachings of Arius, I believe. I know Alaric, for example, was a Christian. Did he practice that Arian form or a Roman Nicaean form?
Yeah, I think the focus on religion, like you're asking about, is just such a fascinating component of the story, both in terms of how Christianity came to Gothia and in terms of the religious identity of the tribes themselves. Like you said, correctly, they didn't have a written language until missionaries showed up. So there's an incredible cultural dynamism that's happening at that border, notwithstanding the kind of geopolitical military movements happening in the same environment, that I think make it it's just so inviting from an outsider's perspective to want to learn more about, because of just how multifaceted it really is. The tribes themselves, what we would call their pagan beliefs, some of them seem to have lasted beyond some of these missionary campaigns. Some tribes grew very, they developed very hardened reactions, very cynical reactions to some of the conversion campaigns. And there was division in the tribes themselves. We have a very famous story of a Goth named Saba, who interestingly will become an important hero for members of the Nicene faith, who at one local dinner party in his tribal village during the visit of some Gothic elders makes a scene of not wanting to eat the shared meat which is being passed around and which had been a part of a Gothic sacrifice. And he says, I can't partake in this meal because it would go against my Christianity. And the Goths they kind of don't know what to do with this type of behavior. There are several Goths, Alaric in particular, later on, don't seem to ever make an issue of these neat and hard and fast dividing lines. So I think, stepping back, the issue of religion in Gothia is just so complicated because of what we don't know. There are followers of Arius who seem to kind of go back to the first missionary campaigns. There are followers of the Nicene Creed, and then there are pagans who don't convert at all. And by the time Alaric attacks, he does seem to be mentioned and included as one of the followers of Arius. But it's very hard to pin them down. And I think that's really surprising, because you would expect in the field of religion for people to be very definitive in some of their outward statements. And it didn't ever seem to be a priority for him.
If we would take a modern Christian and they would go to Gothia, do you think they would recognize the Arian form of Christianity?
It's so, I think it's a very Roman question to ask. I think the Romans themselves were, they wondered the same thing. When they saw the Goths, there was a period in the 370s to 380s where many Goths were fleeing their home because of there was civil war happening in Gothia, and there were invasions to the north that were kind of decimating economic life in Gothia. So in the 370s and the 380s AD, we hear a lot of stories of Gothic migrants coming to the river border and then eventually crossing the river. And it's during some of these stories that we hear this question that you asked. The Romans, who are Christian at the time, are asking themselves, what religion are these people, and can we say anything based upon how they look or what they're bringing with them? And one of the really telling, I think for me as a historian, really telling notices that shows up is that Roman Christians see the Goths bringing a lot of ancestral icons or figures, maybe wooden carvings with them. Sometimes they have cloaks or robes that are foreign to the Roman ideas of what would happen inside of a church. And the Romans are convinced that the Goths are still pagan and that they're using the outward profession of their Christianity to come into Rome as a Trojan horse. And I think it's a wonderful image, because it really gets at how important religious belief was for the Roman people themselves at that point. the Roman Christians were very motivated to try to categorize and to try to label and to try to identify how an object might give away a certain person's identity. And the Goths would bear the brunt of those suppositions.
So Alaric grows up in and around the Roman Empire. Outside of the religious component, how much was he influenced by Roman culture?
I think as a border child, and I know that can, especially to an American historian, can almost sound, too easy, too out of place. He, from what we know of his life story, he grew up at the mouth of the Danube River, which is literally the dividing line between the Roman Empire's people and the world outside. So I think in saying he's a border child, it really does capture everything that we know about what his experience growing up would have been. The fleets of Roman soldiers continually came up and through the Bosphorus into the Danube River mouth to patrol and surveil the landscape overlooking the river. There were traders in Gothia who sold their skins and hawked their wares and traded amber with many of the Roman towns going to and from the mouth, where you might need a little bit of Latin or a little bit of Greek in order to communicate with people. I think his experience growing up, notwithstanding the remarkable trajectory he has as a Roman soldier in his 20s, his experience growing up had to have been connected in many ways, defined in many ways by an opposition to, or maybe even an allure of what was happening in Rome.
We talked about the subjugation and the exploitation. Being a Goth meant going hungry for long periods of time in many circumstances, and for many of them individually. When the Goths were finally coalescing their power, projecting some power, how much of the Gothic raids and pillaging was based on just sheer desperation, and how much was anger at the Romans, or how much of it was just exerting their power, finally?
I think maybe the best way to answer that is to pick one. I like these questions about kind of getting at the heart of really big geopolitical conflicts. Like, I think what you're asking is really, it's important. At what point does the Roman Empire realize or understand the source of the problems that it's starting to witness in a very kind of visible, dramatic way? And I think a lot of historians have tried to tackle that in the abstract. They've tried to tackle it in a kind of looking for patterns type of way. And for me, what was exciting about this story was to figure out if you could do it from a more individual personal experience and maybe then work outwards from that anecdotal personal idea. And for me, the first time we meet Alaric in the sources, securely 100% for sure, happens when he's probably 19 years old, probably 19 or 20. And we see him trying to lead a raid on an imperial convoy inside the Roman Empire. And I think this gets at what you're asking about where does the hostility start to come from? We don't have any sense of why he's buried in the mud of the Macedonian marshes and trying to kind of take down an imperial passing carriage, which may or may not have had the emperor in it. But something about a 19-year-old Goth living at the end of the 4th century sees Rome as an enemy and sees the Roman Empire, what it stands for, as inherently problematic to the goodwill, the standard of living that a Goth would expect to have. So I think for all the reasons that you said, there had to have been a sense of either kind of lost, a missing sense of opportunity, or a missing sense of being able to provide for family, a sense of maybe injustice at the border, closed markets, lost income. By the time we meet Alaric, the first time he steps on stage, he's angry. And I think it has to come from the things that you identified.
So to get to the true understanding of the Goths, obviously we're going to have to understand what's going on in the Roman Empire. The history of the Roman Empire is filled with political intrigue, betrayal, assassination. That's what makes it really interesting. Would you explain the complicated political machinations after the death of Emperor Theodosius and how that destabilizes the Roman Empire right as Alaric is rising to power?
Boy, that's an easy one. This is like you said, the Roman Empire is nothing if not fascinating because of what's happening inside its palaces. And in the earlier period, we have a kind of, it's very easy to hone in on the palace in Rome itself with Caesar's descendants and the legacy of the dynasties that were established there. By the time of Theodosius, and for various, correct or incorrect ways of counting, the Romans identified Theodosius as the 42nd emperor. That clearly there's fudging of the numbers, but someone in Alaric's day would have said, okay, we've been doing this for 42 rulers at this point. By the time of Theodosius, things were remarkably, in some ways, they didn't look as they did 300 years before. And the biggest change in many ways was instead of having one Caesar in power, there were two Caesars in power, usually, because after several constitutional innovations of the past 100 years, the Romans had just decided that it would be slightly more stable to have two chief executives in various parts geographically of the empire, working with two kind of undersecretaries or two vice Caesars who would be able to support them at a moment's notice. You're really looking at a world that recognized the need for a shifting center of power. I think that's really one of the most important things to develop on the eve of Alaric's time. The sense that your emperor could be in Milan, he could be in Trier in the northern European regions, he could be in Istanbul, Constantinople, he could be out in Syria. The palaces ended up kind of settling in Constantinople and in Ravenna, but there was a general sense that the Romans said, okay, if we're going to try to manage, collect taxes, be able to have an army to respond to issues at the frontier, we needed to be a little more nimble than just having someone live on the Palatine Hill in Rome. So this is the world largely that Theodosius inhabits. There's a counterpart to him in the West, and he's eliminated in the course of a very bloody civil war that happens in the 390s. And upon Theodosius's death, this is the moment in which neither palace seems to have any natural successor other than Theodosius's two young children. And it's at that point that one of the sons, Arcadius, takes position in Constantinople, and the other young son, Honorius, takes position in Italy. And it's those two children, I think we're looking at, your listeners are going to be able to correct me right away because I'm going to get it wrong off the top of my head. I think we're looking at two kids who are maybe 19 and 20, 22, 23 at the time that they both take over. This is not going to be promising for the political management of the empire.
In regards to Stilicho, how did a half-Vandal become a powerful Roman general, since we're talking about some of those political machinations that we were just discussing? The most powerful of his time, the most powerful general of his time. He shows up as Alaric's adversary on occasion. He saves the empire, I think, on more than one occasion. Mm-hmm. But he, too, was eventually executed.
Yeah, I mean, he's really a pivotal figure in exactly, like you were saying, this moment of transition for the palaces, the palace in the West and the palace in the East. There's rumor upon Theodosius's early death, having gone to the racetrack one day in January, Theodosius died the very next day. It came, it's always odd to say that death comes suddenly, but this one came very suddenly. It's Stilicho, this insider who happens to be married to Theodosius's niece, that says very forthrightly, I am available to help manage both of the palaces. And happened to being, by chance happened to being a Vandal by his father's side, there are many people in the palaces who are extremely and immediately wary of his trying to gain any additional power. So we do see, starting as soon as Theodosius is dead and as soon as the two sons take over each of the palaces, we see even more of a battle that it kind of has this third figure triangulating into it, who is Stilicho, about to what extent he can serve as tutor to the young princes and to what extent the other bureaucrats are willing to accept his now increased authority. And what's remarkable, I'm glad that you asked about him. He shows up so frequently in Alaric's struggles. What's remarkable about Stilicho is that he seems to have gained so much of his bona fides simply from his wife. And it's a remarkable testament to how a Roman woman, even lacking the kind of normal political channels, normal avenues of public life that a Roman man would, Roman woman like Stilicho's wife, Serena, had incredible authority that she could just immediately, she bestowed credibility on her husband, and people were nervous about it.
Where do Stilicho and Alaric, where do their stories coincide? Where do they meet? I don't know the history, obviously, as well as you do, but I thought there was a time where Alaric was defeated by Stilicho, and he could have been completely removed from the equation, but he's not. Is that correct? Or where do these two actually meet?
You're correct, and we're right kind of chronologically. We're right in time when it all kind of starts to, the pace, I think, of what happens historically starts to pick up a bit with Theodosius' son's death. With Theodosius' son's death, Alaric, who has become a soldier at this point, is waiting for news from the palace in Constantinople of a promotion or a raise, and absent that recognition for how he had served on the battlefield, he grows very disaffected with the government and starts to lash out. The difficulties you alluded to before of Goths going hungry and Goths needing just basic necessities of life, a lot of that struggle takes place in Roman towns and against Roman towns in Greece and in the Eastern Empire. It's a true travesty. The Roman people are not sure why this group living in their midst is now seemingly so disaffected that the Roman way of life is being disturbed. And it's Stilicho who gets wind of this sequence of kind of raids and looting events happening, and Stilicho rushes to stop them. And it's during this period, this kind of 2.5 year period, where between 395 and 397 AD, that Alaric and the Goths are trying to find a way to sustain their life in Greece, and Stilicho is chasing them around, trying to put an end to the ravaging of the countryside. And the sources are a little opaque at this very point in time. I should just say, for good reason, they're opaque. The ancient writers, literally one of them stopped writing around the 390s, and another one started to pick up in the early 5th century. So by total chance, the sources that we have are missing right in this year when things start to become really interesting for Alaric's life. So we have to kind of use their clues as best as we can to figure out what has happened. But as best as we can tell, this is when they first met. This is when Alaric and Silico first met, because at the time there was a sense from Stilicho's part that this guy he was chasing was pretty talented. And there was a sense on Alaric's part that there was no reason to turn against Rome if Rome would help the Goths. And that sense of recognizing a mutual interest in each other's positions is what very likely the sources suggest led to their very first meeting sometime around 397. And they should have, at that point, come to an agreement, and I think they did come to an agreement, that Stilicho would try to use his power to help the Goths as best he could, and Alaric would try to stand down to make sure that he would wait until things turned out more favorably. And the story of the next decade is a story of promises made, promises unkept. It kind of unravels from there.
Now, the Romans they're not normally going back on their promises, are they? That doesn't happen in their history, does it?
That doesn't, which one do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about? There were plenty of instances where, I think one of the ones I enjoyed talking about in the book was the border issues with the Far East during this time. It seems so remote from what's happening in Gothia. But when you think about where the energies of the diplomats were directed and where the ambassadors were focusing and the military planners were focusing, for Rome, it was always the Mesopotamia that was in the news in terms of where the emperors are being sent or where the missions were. And the border of Persia and Rome, and in this particular case, Armenia, was a really fascinating kind of example of what you were just talking about, which is, what happens when promises just go sour. There was an attempt to kind of ally with the Armenian king against Persia, and the Romans had no desire to do that. They had every desire to just kind of cement their own authority in the region. And it led to just there was a locked door, bloody slaughter dinner party. And I think the king, the Armenian king was slaughtered at a Roman invitation, having come to it from a Roman invitation. So there's every reason for the Goths and the Romans to look, Goths in particular, to be wary that anything would really come from a Roman promise.
In regards to the Roman legions, a common interpretation is that the Roman army, due to this massive territorial expansion over a few hundred years, required more soldiers. They had to incorporate many non-Romans into the force. Now, this not only led to loyalty issues, but the Romans created a situation where they actually trained and equipped some of their future enemies. So the technological and training advantages that the Romans may have had in the 1st or 2nd century, by the time, say, of Fritigern and the Battle of Adrianople, they lose those advantages entirely.
Yeah, the thing about foreign soldiers in Rome, which I find so essential to kind of the direction this conversation takes, the conversation about foreign troops in Alaric's day, is that this, for 300 years, let's say roughly, for about 300 years, this was one of the tried and true tested means of becoming a Roman citizen. So if you were a foreigner, you were from outside the city of Rome, and you served in the Roman army, there was 100% chance that when you served and you served loyally to the emperor, you would be granted the status of a Roman citizen upon discharge, either from that campaign or after a certain number of years of service. Roman soldiers of the earlier Roman Empire were so proud of this achievement. It was always memorialized for them. The decree granting them citizenship was always memorialized for them in a small folded bronze plaque. And the word for, I love always talking to people about this who don't know ancient languages, the word for a folded bronze tablet is a diploma. And every time a soldier got a diploma, it was as dear to him as a passport is to us, or a social security card is to us. It's a marker of civic status. And the announcement that a soldier had been given citizenship would be scrawled onto the outside of the Temple of Jupiter in Rome. There was kind of a wall of honors that announced that Rome had expanded its ranks because of the service of these foreign recruits. So I think for me, it's such an important starting point for understanding the later empire, because Rome had this push to recognize. I think the politicians were very smart, from the emperors down to the bureaucrats. They recognized, if we figure out how to give people the right to make a will, the right to pass down money in their family, the right to adjudicate their grievances before a Roman judge, and, the right to not be sold into slavery. These were ways of growing. I mean, they grew businesses at the frontier. They helped sustain communities throughout the empire. Citizenship really was the way that Romans had for 200, 300 years, incorporating difference into what was a very kind of multidimensional, multi-ethnic whole. And in 212 AD, this is probably one of the most important dates as a backstory to Alaric's complicated life. In 212 AD, the emperors decided this was such an important way of building community that they extended it to everyone who was freeborn throughout the Roman Empire. The knock-on effect of that decision is really what's so profound and profoundly shapes the world that Alaric grew up in, because after 212, the Romans will never, and this sounds like a little constitutional wonkishness, but you have to understand the true effect here. The Romans will never go back and change their laws or their policies to make the end of military service equivalent to citizenship, which means one of the paths by which foreign soldiers had gained citizenship is now no longer, as far as we know, a path to citizenship. And that, I think, is really what's remarkable, is that it's not that there's now more foreign soldiers in the empire necessarily, but that what they would be rewarded with has been taken away.
So Alaric, you had mentioned that first time he shows up in the historical record, a talented warrior. He becomes a Roman prefect. When do things go sideways with the Roman Empire? Is it with the death of Theodosius and the two young emperors?
I think the most fascinating, enigmatic, just chilling piece of information from all of the sources that you could look at comes in a scrap of something from the 5th century. And it says, Alaric's decision to attack Rome was the result of Stilicho's murder. And that it was Stilicho's wife, Serena, who inspired Alaric to go forward with his plans to begin the famine that would lead to the eventual attack on the city. And as a piece of historical information, as something written in ancient Greek from, the actual contemporary times, it is just mind-bogglingly frustrating because it comes with no context and it comes with no so-and-so thought that this was the case, or, but I know that this is really what happened. Like, it comes with none of the caveats or the elaboration that you would hope something as pivotal as that is would have. But if we take it on its face value, something what led to Stilicho's murder, the traditional Roman thinking, like you alluded to earlier, this half-Vandal is not doing as good of a job as he could be doing on the battlefield, or he's not preventing any of these attacks the way that we thought he was going to. Something about the disillusionment on the inside with Stilicho and his apparent compromised position leads to his murder in 408. And in 408, we're told that is what inspires Alaric to say, this is the tipping point. This is the sideways moment for sure, when I can't keep going forward anymore. So I think when you kind of step back and you say, wow, like what could have been going on, especially given that Serena, Stilicho's wife, is mentioned in the same breath, I think what's interesting is to kind of draw the parallels between Serena and Alaric. These are two people who, they're both untimely born, meaning they don't have any paths to power in the world that they live in. She's a woman. She doesn't have, she's eminently more capable than the two princes are, but is entirely locked out of political power. They're both people who understand an outsider's perspective. Alaric had served in the Roman army, but wasn't allowed to be promoted beyond where the emperors thought he should go. And Stilicho is kind of similarly fighting under this kind of self-grudge or this notable sense of being different. At some point, Alaric must and this is my supposition, and I'm clear about that. I think he must have recognized what she recognized, and that they must have recognized it together, which is if this world was going to make any place for people like them, that a radical course of action needed to be followed and not anything inside the norm of political behavior. And I think that's what leads to the attack on Rome.
What would have happened if Alaric would have been offered that legitimacy? If he would have been offered a senior Roman military command?
It's such a good question. I love the what if questions. I think they're really, really important for getting the mind running in different creative directions and asking what the sources could tell us, or even kind of asking us to frame questions in different ways. To me, I have to say that his promotion would have delayed the inevitable. And for me, that's the sense that in the post-212 world, in a world that was becoming even more globally integrated than the Roman Empire had been in its earlier days, more languages, more cultures, more sense of other people's ethnicities, more religious dynamic than ever before. In a world in which foreigners were continuing to cross the boundaries of the empire, and they would come and work as cooks and work as laborers and joined Roman cities and faith communities, there was an inevitable conversation that had to happen about whether they had second-tier legal status or whether they were going to be recognized as Roman citizens. And that is a conversation that the Roman people of Alaric's day never wanted to reopen. And so I think a promotion for Alaric, someone like him, would have delayed the inevitable, because I don't think he was the type of person to let big issues go unaddressed.
So what are the details of the sack of Rome in 410, which most school children read about? I know that Alaric only stays for 3 days. Rome rebuilds after that. But what are the psychological, impacts of the sacking of Rome, the destruction of the idea of the Invicta Roma? I know St. Augustine, for example, writes about it with dismay and sadness. Is that how most Romans would have viewed it?
It's crushing to hear a man like St. Augustine or a man like St. Jerome, who also writes about the event. It's crushing to read their words. And they can be they're so powerful because they come from both of them were men of faith. They came from a well of understanding of biblical ideas and imagery. And the sense of Jerome speaks of the smoke floating over the orange roofs of Rome that he wishes he could see to be able to mourn. And Augustine, speaks of people fleeing on boats and coming to his community in North Africa. The weight of that moment is clear in the sources of the churchmen, at least. I think your question is absolutely right to ask, well, what about everyone else? And I think that's where the real, that's where the real fun happens, because the men who were friends with the Jeromes and the Augustines, who also happened to write their own versions of what happened. I'm thinking here of this 5th century historian named Orosius from Spain, was also he was also a Christian. He visited the city after the attack and kind of did a man on the street reporting, getting a sense of what everyone thought of the attack. And he has just a brilliant quip that from someone he spoke to. He said, if you ask them what had happened in 410 AD, they would have said, the city looks like it's recovered and it was no big deal. So there was every range of opinion I think we can imagine about the attack. And yet there were still, though, I think you have to put it upon the intellectuals, maybe the ones who left the literary record behind, who said people were still wrestling, a year or two, decade after, with why it happened. It may not have been devastating to life in the city, but it was devastating to the psyche for sure. And people took multiple directions. They said this was, this is good versus evil. This is, we were being attacked by hostile forces, by savages, by barbarians. And then there were others who were just a little more realistic and said quite explicitly, this is the result of Rome's mistreatment of its foreigners.
So even though Alaric was successful there and he accomplished something that hadn't been done in hundreds of years, in many ways, he only stays for 3 days. And if you're a Goth, you can only carry almost, only so much stuff in your arms out of the city. It just didn't seem successful. I kind of imagine Alaric walking through the streets and almost having, this imperial city and almost having a feeling of failure.
100% correct. I think you're absolutely right. That's my impression too, and certainly how I wanted to end the story, because I think he dies a failure. He absolutely dies a failure, notwithstanding what it is he was able to walk away with. The larger, when you put the larger issues into context, when the historical discussions of what's the social political reality for citizens and non-citizens at the end of the 4th century, 5th century, when that's there, then it helps see that he did not get what he was fighting for. And by the time he died, his followers around him were completely decimated and disillusioned. They had nothing. They got nothing. No land, no rights. He was expecting to take them to North Africa because there was food there in 410, and even the ships couldn't make the crossing. He had to turn back, and that's when he died. I think there's a reason why no one tells his story for hundreds of years. There's a reason why no one thinks of recovering that story until, let's say, the 16th century or 17th century. And it's because he is not a great man of history. And I think that's just clear as day.
So what's his legacy then, Dr. Boin? He's a military commander. He seemingly succeeds on the battlefield, not in all occasions, but in the end, he has the sack of Rome. So what's his legacy after that?
To me, I think his legacy comes in being so contradictory. I think one of the things that drove me to tell his story and to hope that I got it right was to do justice to how complicated his life was. He was someone who at various points in time was fighting against the empire and fighting for the empire. And as an outsider, he offers us an invitation that I think is so rare to have from this time period. And that is, it's an invitation to have a conversation about something we know really, really well, the ancient world, and to do it from someone else's point of view. That to me is priceless when you really think about it, because there's just so much waiting to be uncovered when you see things through a different set of eyes. And I think if that changes how we view the Roman Empire, then Alaric didn't die a failure. I think Alaric's story has a lot to teach us.
One last question, trying to make a connection to today. In the world today, there are refugees crises in many areas, the Middle East and Asia and Africa and Central America. Can we learn something from Gothic history and how they were exploited by the Romans so we can avoid violence and destruction that human desperation can cause?
I honestly hope that we do. I think one of the most powerful moments in Alaric's story, the moment that made me wake up, so to speak, when I was writing it, was the story of the children at the border of the Danube whom the Roman Empire separated from their parents and sent to Asia Minor so that they would grow up away from their families and potentially become less hostile or less aggressive to their adopted home. When I encountered that moment, when I kind of saw the evidence for it, stared at it face to face, and recognized that the details of it remain as murky to us now as it probably was intentionally meant to be in the 4th century. It's when I think, realized really kind of to my core that our history goes in circles. and we move forward, but we have to go back and dive into some of these other times, if only because we can't make the same mistake.
Well, thanks, Professor Boin. I really appreciated it, and that was a good time. I had a good time. I think Alaric's first Christmas special was a success.
I think so. I think so too. I only wish that we could have had an apotheosis or some urban chestnut beer to go along with the event.
I would like to thank my guest today, Dr. Douglas Boin. And if you would like to get his book, Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's History of the Fall of Rome, simply click on the link in the description below. You may have read other accounts of the fall of Rome. There are several out there. But Dr. Boin takes a unique approach. He presents this momentous time in human history, not from the perspective of a Roman, but from the perspective of a Goth. And not just any Goth, the Gothic king Alaric. If you enjoyed the conversation today, please share it with a friend. The podcast directories have an excellent sharing function that works great. You can share it via email or text, so get our word out there. Our featured brew was Southern Gothic Unfiltered Pilsner from the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company of California. Remember to subscribe to the podcast. Simply click the subscribe button on the directory that you use. Subscribing, of course, is the only way to get new episodes right after they're released right away. To the Histriogoians from 40 countries and hundreds of cities across the country, I would like to say thank you. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, so a big thank you to them as well. There are many other great episodes on the way. They're coming soon, including the classical philosophy of the Founding Fathers, the history of Christmas, and the 80s baseball rivalry between the Cardinals and the Mets. That should be a lot of fun. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.